Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith.
Right, that's us.
Yes, indeed. That is
the best. We are the number one Bible Bistro themed, or I was going to say Bistro themed Bible study podcast on air.
We're the best kept secret in the restoration movement. I don't know what I'm saying.
Like that.
I don't know.
Anyway,
we are back. We are still going through Daniel.
Yeah, we are.
Is,
we went through Daniel.
Yeah, we've been going through that. Lots have been happening. We've got through. Now, you correctly pointed out, I had said that we were through the narrative portion of this, Daniel 1 through 6, then we got to 7, and I said the narrative was over, and you're like, no, this is still
narrative-y.
It's still. Is that the correct linguistic term?
Yes, narrative-y.
Narrative-y.
It's interesting. Of course, I'm all about narrative. It's really changed the way I read scripture and that kind of thing. And it just occurred to me the other day. I mean, I should say the other day, a couple of years ago. But I'm to that age.
It's that age.
It was last Wednesday. Oh no, wait, it was 5 years ago.
The other day, the 1980s.
I was thinking about, I was reading the book of Leviticus, as one does, and I noticed that it's interesting because we think about that as the law, it's just a listing of laws, but it actually has a narrative framework to it as well. God's speaking to Moses and he's telling him these things, and it's just interesting it's just kind of the normal way that we communicate in a lot of ways. We tell stories, and it's very interesting when you start reading scripture and you notice. Even here. So this one begins with kind of a narrative. Before we started, though, I was going to mention this podcast will be coming out on a holiday.
A holiday? What holiday?
Reformation Day. I know most people think
Is that a federal holiday?
No. I know most people think today, this Tuesday, October 31st, is Halloween, but it's also the day that Martin Luther famously nailed his 99 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Chapel. And thus it's sometimes called Reformation Day as well.
And the rest is fragmented history.
the rest is 15,000 popes. But little Dieta Verms joke there. The funniest thing I've seen, we should put this meme up. It's got a Martin Luther jack-o'-lantern carved pumpkin, and then above it is 99 candy bars, Reese's candy bars. So the nailing of the 99 Reese's to the door.
Oh my gosh.
All right.
Well,
you want to get it, Daniel?
So much for the humor in the episode. The 99 Reese's. That's gonna stick with me now.
He nailed 99 Reese's to the door.
Well, Martin Luther, and then that's it. All went from there.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Interesting.
Now we have a podcast.
The only thing that one of 15,000 podcasts. The only thing I was going to say was I just occurred to me, and you may have heard this before, that I've heard that wasn't, because we always make it this act of rebellion. He takes a hammer and he nails this to the door, right? Mm-hmm. But what I've been told is that this was a normal place that people would put announcements, and basically he was just kind of like putting up an announcement, inviting debate. It wasn't this big act of rebellion.
Right next to it was like free guitar lessons. Pull the number.
Pull off the number.
Pull off the tab. Oh wait, what's this? Martin put up something.
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyway,
I've heard. All right. So
back to Daniel 8.
So let's start with Daniel 8.
Daniel 8.
So here's the narrative part of this. Look, go ahead and read Daniel 8, 1 through 2, if you would.
Okay. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal.
Ulai Canal, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Is that it? Is that what you want to read?
Yeah, just that far is fine. And so this is kind of giving us the setting of this vision. And that's what I mentioned. It's telling us this story. Daniel's not just like, here's my vision, but he's saying, this is where I was. This is what I was doing.
And this is the one after the one I already had.
Well, and do you remember? Well, let's ask. Let's see how much you remember from the last time we recorded. Daniel 7, do you remember when he said that vision took place?
Oh, it was in the first
year of King Belshazzar. So, I talked then about the kind of the turnover and this kind of thing as the beginning of this visionary system. But then we have the third year is when this is given. He's in the province of Elam and in the citadel of Susa is what it said. So Susa was it is a city that. So here's again where we are in the time that he puts this vision. There would not have been a Susa; it would have been destroyed. And so then it was later by the Medes and the Persians. It was made into a fortified city. So that's kind of an interesting thought that he's there in Susa is kind of where he envisions himself when he gives this vision that has to do with the rise of the Medes and the Persians, not to give away the ending, but then also the fall of the Medes and Persians. And so that's what I think is going on. So this area where this river, what we believe is a river, this canal, where it's found is in the southeastern part of what we would call Iran today. It's in the border of Iran and Iraq in that area. And so he's kind of there and looking across the river toward the west from where he is. Susa would have been seen from a Jewish perspective as kind of the center of the Mede and Persian Empire. Again, in terms of the time of Daniel's writing, in a later period, it would have been considered important. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I get this right.
All right.
So he's in the citadel of Susa, which would have not been there in the third year of King Belshazzar.
Yeah. So he has a vision that he's there in Susa. And so, I guess the point is I'm trying to say the significance is this would have been a center of the Mede and the Persian Empire. So,
right. So he's
makes sense.
So he's in Babylonian captivity.
Yes.
Medes and Persians have not come through yet and taken the Babylonian.
Right.
And so, but he's having this vision in the future where he's kind of in the citadel of the Medes and Persians.
Yeah. having a vision of the future, I would say. Yeah.
My language, I just throw words out there.
The other part of this then is that Susa also later became an important part of the Seleucid Empire. And that's going to be a big part of this chapter as well. So that's what I think is the significance of him being there. So,
okay.
Other thoughts on that or questions or comments?
No, I have no thoughts. I would have not known that unless you had said that.
Well, that's what I'm here for. So verses 3 and 4, go ahead and read verses 3 and 4 if you would.
I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead. As we work through this chapter, I'm going to kind of go ahead and give you the interpretation, even though the interpretation of this is almost verbatim spelled out later in the chapter. When we get down there, it's just going to be kind of a repetition. What's different between 7 and 8? You remember we had vision of, I shouldn't say we did, but Daniel had vision of animals or beasts in chapter 7. The difference is those were kind of fearsome beasts, right? Lions and bears and this kind of stuff. What we have here are more domesticated animals. Some commentators even point out these are clean animals. Both a ram and a goat, we're going to see in just a minute, are clean animals. They're animals that you can eat if you're a Jewish person. So it's a little bit different in that nature. I'll go ahead and tell you this though. The history we talked about, the 4 kingdoms that we talked about in Daniel chapter 7, we're kind of zooming in and talking about a very specific historical period of 2 of those kingdoms is what we're going to talk about here. And both of these are going to, as we mentioned already, are going to be future to the time of Daniel giving this prophecy. So we've already seen horns, and we've talked about horns are, power. They have to do with power. They have to do with being rulers. So I'll go ahead and tell you, and I mentioned this last week when we had the vision of the bear. Do you remember what was significant about the bear? How it was described?
Very bearish.
It was. It was the
Ferocious claws or something. I don't know.
It was the most bear-like of the animals that we talked about. It was raised up on one side, and I said we're going to get this repeated kind of idea of the unevenness when we talk about this kingdom. Here we see it when it says it has two horns. So horns, again, power, rulers, but it says one of them is longer than the other one, right? So this is kind of the idea of one has more power, one is stronger than the other. And this is always going to be the case. I mentioned this last week when we talk about the empire, the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Persians come later, but they're more powerful. And so that's kind of this idea of the two horns here with this ram. This idea, it says here, the ram's described as going to the north and the south and the east and west. No animal can stand against it. This is talking about its conquest, that when the Medes and the Persians take over the Babylonians, there's no one able to stop them. And so during that period of time when the Medes and the Persians are ruling, then this is what's being described here, their conquest of the world.
Gotcha.
So thoughts on that?
No, I mean, it's just, let me ask you this question. Why are the Medes and Persians put together? Like they're, we say them as like one kingdom, but they're separate kingdoms. Like why are they put together like the way that they are?
It's because of the way that the transition takes place between them. It's not a conquest, right? It's not like the Persians come along and defeat the Medes. They kind of go together. They rule together. There's a smoother transition between the Medes and the Persians being dominant, if you will. So it's not like we're going to see with this next empire coming through and conquering militarily, but they're working together in order to overthrow the Babylonians. I think that's the big thing that we got going on.
I mean, it's interesting. We don't see that very often, and they have their own kings. But then that they're separate, but not, and
right.
So anyway,
yeah, you're right. It is a little bit different. Yeah.
That was my one question I had. Is
okay, that's a good question.
Why they typically go together is in this one animal.
So I'll go ahead and read verse 5. I find this interesting. We're introduced to another animal here. It says, as I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes, unlike any goat you've ever seen, I'm sure.
Unigoat.
A unicorn. Well, and there, it's interesting you should say this, because the idea of the unicorn, there have been people who've brought that up, but a prominent horn between its eyes. And again, I think we're thinking symbolically here more about one prominent, one strong ruler is what we're thinking about, in contrast to the ram. It came from the west. So again, Daniel's standing looking across the Ulai Canal. This is coming from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. So just like we saw, you might remember last week, this leopard which had wings,
like an eagle. I think
this is a speedy. This is a fast goat, right? This is an extremely fast goat. It crosses the whole earth. So this talks about the extent of its conquering, and it does it without touching the ground, which talks about its speed. I'll come back and say maybe more about that, but I'll go ahead and tell you, and later on we're going to see that this goat is in reference to a Greek king who we call Alexander the Great. And what it's really referring to is not only the degree with which he was able to conquer the ancient world, but also the speed with which he conquered the ancient world. Really from a period, only about a 3-year period, from 334 to 331 BC, did it take Alexander and his armies, that period of time to overcome and to destroy the Persian Empire and to defeat them, and to really become the dominant force then in the ancient world. And that's what we find described then in verses 6 and 7. I'll go ahead and keep reading about the goat. It came toward, so this is the goat with a prominent horn. It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns, so breaking its power, we would say. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. So here's the turnover from the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians to the Greek kingdom that we saw behind the power of Alexander the Great. Okay, thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm just picturing a goat and a ram
A goat or
fighting.
ram. Yeah, and again, this is the interesting thing. Just like, and this is why I mentioned that to begin with. So in chapter 7, we had kind of these fabulous beasts, right? These mythical creatures. Here we have, more common kind of barnyard animals, but they're not. They're still symbols, right? They're not acting in the normal ramish kind of way,
Goatish,
right? They're a goat with a prominent horn is not something we're trying to think of. Like when I said the unicorn, we're not. Or you said the unicorn. We're not trying to think of this in a literal sense, but this is symbolic, right? I will mention this rams. We talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about some of the symbolic animals that various. Like the Babylonians, for example, this idea of a lion with wings. It's the same kind of thing we see with the ram's head has been suggested was a Persian, for the Persian armies, was a symbol that they would carry. And so, again, for someone in the ancient world, it might have rung a bell to say, oh, okay, yeah, this is talking about the Medes and the Persians here in that case.
Okay.
But again, I don't think we're thinking about any kind of, we have to be careful of that because we're not necessarily trying to draw a one-to-one comparison between all of them, right? It's not like you would normally think of the goat in connection with the Greeks. I'll say something else later maybe. So then go ahead and read verse 8 for me, because then it talks about something that happens to this goat that may be a little unexpected.
The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Okay,
so this is a reference. If the goat is Alexander the Great, then at the height of his power, this goat dies, right? This goat's power is taken away. The horn is broken off. So if we think about this horn, this prominent horn being Alexander the Great, it's broken. And this reminds us of the story of his death, which took place, when he was still a young person, not long after he had conquered, all of these kingdoms. And had settled in the area of Persia, is where he had established his kingdom in Iran, and as a young man still died, probably of some kind of disease, we think. That happened in 323 BC is when Alexander died. But then what's the other thing it says? At the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns, right? Correct. And I mentioned last week we're going to see these 4 often be in reference to the diadokoi. I think you asked me about what does diadokoi mean, and it means successors. The successors to Alexander is really what diadokoi means. So kind of the shorthand way that we say this in Greek is just the successors. And I mentioned those 4. I couldn't remember all of them in name last time, but Cassander and Lysimachus were 2 that we don't spend too much time on because they are the general. So these are 4 generals of Alexander that essentially fought over the control of his empire. He did not leave at this point a clear successor, although you may know, I don't know how much you know about Alexander the Great, but I'm sure you know quite a bit. But Alexander, he had commanded for his generals and his officers and his army to marry women from that area, because where he was trying to establish the empire, because he wanted to basically, take over the trappings of that royalty. He died young before he could really, I don't want to say this, consolidate the strength of his power, and so it really was kind of left to his own. He had not left a successor, an heir.
And when he moved through, he was moving through so fast. He didn't really establish government. It was like, I conquered and I'm on to the next one, without really establishing the power in that area.
The way I describe what Alexander's tactics were, in short, this is, you could write PhD theses on this, but I'm just gonna say this kind of quickly. Basically, he would come in, and if a country, let's say the leaders of a country, were willing to acknowledge Alexander's control, then he would allow them to pretty much continue on as they were. He didn't spend a lot of time, restructuring things. It's like, if you're going to acknowledge my army's superiority, then we're not going to destroy your religion. We're not going to upset your governing structure. We're going to allow you to pretty much go on as normal, as long as you acknowledge us. This is what happened for Judea. And this is why the temple was left in place at this point, because they essentially accepted and acknowledged when Alexander came through, they acknowledged that he was heir. In fact, there's stories that they said, we have been your coming has been prophesied to us. Maybe even, and probably even, a reference to the book of Daniel. And so the priests were willing to accept his rule, and they did very little. If a nation or a city were to resist, then he would make an example of them, and he would do everything that he could to destroy them. It's not only, I said that in Judea, when he got to Jerusalem, it's said that he even offered offering in the temple. He practiced Judaism, and there's other examples of this. Is if a nation would accept him, he would make use of whatever myths were there about him or about conquering. Basically, he would put himself in that place, and it was very wise. I mean, he didn't waste a lot of time on people that were not resisting him, but for the nations or the cities that resisted him, he absolutely
annihilated
destroyed them. So, so it was that's how he did it so quickly. But you can see that kind of left, the difference between him and the later Romans is the Romans really made sure that these things were happening according to our pattern of governing, right? So they were much slower in their conquering, but it was a much more unified empire after Rome was done with it than what Alexander did. All that is to say, at his death, even though his wife that he had taken was pregnant, they didn't know if it was a boy or girl. He essentially left no clear successor, and that's why his generals ended up battling for control. So all that's go back to say Cassander and Lysimachus went back to the east, or I'm sorry, to the west. They're too far west for our interest. They went back to Greece and to Western Asia Minor. So those areas, at least for this part of the story of the Bible, are outside of our area of interest. But there are these other two generals, and we've mentioned them before. Ptolemy, who was a general of Alexander the Great, went back to Egypt, and he set up his empire there. Actually, a really smart place to do it because it was a very defensible area, and we see the Ptolemaic Egypt then is able to be established for centuries. Even Cleopatra, famous Cleopatra, is a part of that Ptolemaic empire, by the way, just out of interest's sake, for a later period of time. But then the other general is named Seleucus. And so this, what Seleucus basically does is he takes over the area that Alexander the Great had been occupying in Mesopotamia, in Persia, but it also came around, and we call them Syrians a lot of times because, again, from the perspective of the Holy Land, they are controlling this area to the north, the area of Syria to the north, Ptolemy and Egypt to the south. And so the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, Seleucids is what we call this whole period of time. So Seleucus was the name of the general, but Seleucids is what we call his successors. And basically the Seleucids and the Ptolemies battle over the Holy Land for the next several centuries. So all that clear as mud.
As one does.
Well, it's a story. It's a story of these times, right?
Right.
What? Any questions on that? I know that was a lot to go through. So
no. So neither one of them. They're both just trying to lay claim to this area then.
And we find, and this is really, we're going to see this in chapter 10 as well, the book of Daniel. I'll go ahead and prepare you for that, because there are times where the Ptolemies are able to have a greater control over what we would call Judea. And there are times where the Seleucids have greater control over this area. That is modern day Israel, or call it whatever you will. I'm almost afraid to call it anything these days, but this area, that's why I use the term Holy Land, right? Uh-huh. And so that's why that's where this battle is taking place, and that's for God's people, right? That is the important part of this story.
All right, so those are our 4 prominent horns. The 4 generals have broken it up for our purposes. Ptolemies and Seleucids.
Seleucids are the most important ones for us to consider. And I think I mentioned before, the Ptolemies weren't very creative when it came to naming their children. So, the kings during this whole time, names literally were Ptolemy. Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third, that's easy to remember. The Seleucids were slightly more creative in that we find 2 names that are prominent, Seleucus and Antiochus. So it kind of skips generations. And we're going to see Antiochus, we're going to get to this person that's important for us, Antiochus the Fourth, and even his brother's name was Seleucus. But just reporting the news.
They got other things to worry about besides naming kids.
We're just going to name our kids, these things. But Seleucus or Antiochus, if you ever hear those names, those are Seleucid kings typically. So, all right, I think that's all. Did I read the rest of? Okay, so then we get to 9 through 11. So these 4 prominent horns, to the end of verse 8 again, grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So imagine them scattered, throughout the empire. Out of one of them came another horn. Now I'm going to go ahead and tell you the end of this is
horns on horns on horns.
So the Seleucus would be one of these 4 horns, one of these Diadokoi, one of these successors of Alexander the Great, and it's out of his horn that this small horn grows up. So out of one of them came another horn, and I don't know if you remember back in chapter 7 we had this small horn already, and we talked about him a little bit. So he started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. And so beautiful land here is just a way to refer to the Holy Land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens and threw down some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. I want to come back to that and talk about that, because that's one that I've always thought about a lot, really an interesting story. And there's different ways we can talk about that. So this horn, of course, we've already given away. We're talking about a he, but in the vision, he's still an it. It's a horn. It set itself up as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. So this is a reference then to Antiochus the Fourth, who called himself Epiphanes, which means God made manifest, God showing himself on earth. So Antiochus the Fourth, he's one of the descendants of Seleucus. And what happened in Antiochus, we have a whole episode on this you can go listen to another time, is because Antiochus was resisted by the Jewish people, he determined that he was going to absolutely wipe out Judaism. That became his one of his goals in life, was just to completely do away with Judaism. He changed the policy. You remember me saying that Alexander pretty much said, hey, you guys, if you acknowledge my greatness, you can go on as you wish.
Right.
That had continued really up to the time of Antiochus the Fourth. And Antiochus is the one who brought a new policy. That's a really soft word for what he did, but he brought a new attitude toward the Jewish people and basically wanted them to acknowledge his sovereignty and his power. He saw himself as God in the flesh, and so he really had no other place for any other kind of God. So it mentions, did you see that idea that there's a couple of references here that we have a hard time knowing exactly what to do with. One of them is this idea of the starry host. Even some of the starry host were thrown down and he trampled on them. Mm-hmm. And then the other one is it talks about the commander of the Lord's army. And so the whole question here is, are we talking about supernatural beings? Because there are times where stars stand for angels, right? Mm-hmm. But there's also a way in which this idea of the stars can refer to God's people. We see this in the scriptures as well, where sometimes we are called to shine like stars, for example. And so what I think is going on here is this is talking about his opposition to God's holy people. And when I say God's holy people, I'm talking about to those who were staying true to what they believed that God had commanded in his law. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when Antiochus resisted God's people and was trying to force them into abandoning the law, then this is what I think is being referred to. The rest of the story, of course, we've talked about this before, is that Antiochus ended up desecrating the temple. And this is what was referred to. We talked last week about the abomination that brings desolation. Mm-hmm. We see this, we're going to see in just a little bit, this referred to in a similar term, but slightly different term. But this abomination that brings desolation is when he sets up a statue to Zeus in the temple, a place where there was not to be any graven images. He sets it up in the temple in Jerusalem. So the temple's desecrated. The daily sacrifices stopped. And did you hear that when he talked about that?
Yep.
So God's people were no longer able to do what they had been doing in the temple since it had been, basically rebuilt during the time of Zerubbabel, after, you might remember, it was destroyed in 586 BC. And then it was rebuilt when Zerubbabel came back into the Holy Land, and so the sacrifice was stopped, which was a horrible thing, and he desecrated the temple in that way, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. What I wanted to do is I wanted to read a little bit from 2 Maccabees, though, because Maccabees, of course, are the heroes of this story. They're the ones, Judas Maccabeus is the one who's able to lead a rebellion, and his father Mattathias is the one who began it. They're able to lead this rebellion and kind of defeat Antiochus and retake, I shouldn't say they defeat him completely, but they're able to retake the temple in Jerusalem. They're able to reestablish the sacrifice. And that's what a lot of the prophecy in Daniel and a lot of the prophecy from this period of time is pointing toward. It's pointing toward that time when the Maccabees are going to come and they're going to be able to reestablish this sacrifice. Comments or questions on any of that? I know there's a lot there too.
No, so he did the statue of Zeus, and I don't know if I read this somewhere that he also sacrificed maybe a pig.
Yeah, he did. He sacrificed a pig on the altar, which was considered an unclean animal, right? For the Jewish people.
It was kind of he is trying not just kill the Jews, but kind of destroy the monotheistic system.
He made it. Yes, he made it. You couldn't have the Torah. He tried to destroy the book of the law. He forced people to eat unclean foods, basically go against their conscience. He forced people at threat of death. When I say forced people, he basically had his soldiers kill them if they would not offer incense to foreign gods. And so, he was systematically trying to wipe out Judaism.
So it wasn't necessarily about the people themselves, but it was the belief system that made them want to resist his power and his control over that.
And that's why he was wanting to do it, I think, is he wanted to make sure they were being compliant with him and doing what he called them to. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I was going to read this from 2 Maccabees about the stars because I find this interesting. This is so you got to understand. So 2 Maccabees is a book of the Apocrypha, right? But so it's written. We don't believe it's inspired. It's written at a later period of time than things like Daniel, in my opinion, at least. And here's the reason I mention that is it's kind of they're not propaganda exactly, but they really paint Antiochus Epiphanes in the most negative light possible. Mm-hmm. So this is talking about the end of Antiochus's life, Antiochus Epiphanes, when they believed God judged him and gave him a wasting disease, gave him worms basically, and he ended up dying from it. Because of God's judgment, a little bit like what we saw with Nebuchadnezzar and kind of that story.
Yeah.
If you think about that. So I just love the way that he puts this, though, the author here. Thus, he who only a little while before had thought in his superhuman arrogance that he could command the waves of the sea and had imagined that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. So he kind of in a play on words, right? Here was God manifest they're carrying him on their back on a stretcher basically because he was so sick. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms. And while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away. And because of the stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. Because of this intolerable stench, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before had thought that he could touch the stars of the heaven. And that's where I wanted to go to. So you see what I'm saying? In Daniel, it's like this idea that he thought to throw down these stars of heaven, which I take to be, priests, the holy ones of God who were supposed to be standing in this place. And he's trying to pull them over to his side. That's what I think Daniel is talking about. He throws down even some of the holy ones, even some of the stars of heaven, and tramples them underfoot. Then it was, I might as well go ahead and give the death there. Then it was broken in spirit. He began to lose much of his arrogance and to come to his senses under the scourge of God, for he was tortured with pain every moment. And when he could not endure his own stench, he uttered these words, "It is right to be subject to God. Mortals should not think that they are equal to God." So
well, there you go.
Yeah. I just find that funny. I guess funny is not exactly the right word, but just how, you can hear the hatred almost of the author there.
Right.
I'm going to portray this guy in the worst possible light.
He's got a stench.
He really stinks.
He really stinks, literally.
And so, and it's similar to what we've seen in Daniel already, right? This idea that the arrogance of these kings to think that they are the ones who are calling the shots, when in fact it is God is the one who is sovereign in all of these things, right? That's kind of, I think, the message that Second Maccabees is giving us here. Okay, anything on that? I just wanted to.
No, I think it's. I like to read like the Maccabees and the intertestamental stuff because it gets us. This is one of those things that if we're not looking at this stuff on our own, it's not in the Bible, to kind of help us understand what's happening here.
Yeah, and these would have been stories. Here's where they help us the most, not just with Daniel, but these are the stories that Jesus' disciples grew up on.
Worldview.
Exactly. These are the stories that they would have known. So when they see Jesus coming along and they're thinking of the Romans a lot like Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Mm-hmm. They're going, we're watching history play out in our, and they were, but not in the way that they thought.
Right. They're thinking they were going to see the Caesar have worms in his stomach again. And
when Peter cut off the ear of the high priest, the servant of the high priest, when he cut off Malchus's ear, I think he's thinking, man, I'm going to be in, the next Maccabean book, right? Or the equivalent to it. And of course, ironically, then later he reminds us, the Old Testament tells us to seek peace and pursue it, right? But he's the one who drew the sword on the night Jesus was arrested and was going to defend him to the death, right?
Right.
So anyway,
we're getting this background. I mean, it helps, but I think it's when you start to think about what the Jewish people were expecting when they in the New Testament, right, and why Jesus is coming was kind of it was a hard thing for them to swallow, is because they were listening back to these stories of growing up of the Maccabees. Yeah.
So the last thing it talks about here is this idea of the commander of the army of the Lord. And again, We sometimes think about like these supernatural beings, like Michael is called the commander of the Lord's army at sometimes, but I think we may be thinking about like the high priest or those who were supposed to be standing in the way here, and Antiochus is able to even defeat them for a period of time is the idea. So
Yeah.
So go ahead and read verse 12. This is just describing a little bit more of what he did.
Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground.
Okay, it again, because we're talking about the horn, right? But truth thrown to the ground is probably that idea of the Torah, right? The law itself was thrown to the ground, was no longer, was destroyed, was done away with, and then the daily sacrifices. So then verse 13, we have this supernatural guide step in. So verse 13 says, then I heard a holy one speaking. Remember, we always in apocalyptic have these interpretations given by these holy ones. I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long, which is the typical question in apocalyptic, right? How long are things going to be the way that they are? How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation. So there's that abomination that causes desolation. Mm-hmm. He's not just talking about that single event of the statue to Zeus and the sacrifice of the pig on the altar, but he's talking about this whole rebellion that Antiochus is leading against God, against his people. The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. How long is this going to take place? And he said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be consecrated. So 2,300, here's one of these numbers, right? 2,300 evenings and mornings. So what do you think's going on there? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Does it have anything to do with like the sacrifices, like in the mornings and evenings?
Okay, so there was a morning and evening sacrifice in the temple. That was one of the things that took place. So this is our number that we're friends with, but it's double that because it's talking about the mornings and evenings. So it's 2,300. Half of that's 1,150. A little over 3 years again, 1,150 days. So we're talking about that period of time, probably the literal period of time that the sacrifice was stopped. From the time when Antiochus stopped the sacrifice until the time when Judas Maccabeus' forces were able to reestablish the daily sacrifice is 1,150 days or 2,300 mornings and evenings. In other words, that's the number of sacrifices that were missed by God's people during that period of time. That's what I think is the idea here. It's that time and times and times and a half a time. Is what we have going on here.
From Daniel 7. Yeah,
I think so.
It's this time of testing and trial.
Time of trial, yeah. When God's people are in the book of Revelation, it's when the Gentiles are trampling the temple grounds. It's the sanctuary. It's that period of time. So we're talking about.
Yeah, as you're reading this out loud, is like how long will it take? You brought that up. Like that's always the question.
Sure.
Again, this reminds me. Revelation reminds me of this. When the
fifth seal, the slain saints under the altar, and the fifth seal. How long, O Lord, faithful and true, until you avenge our blood? Right.
Mm-hmm. It's that same. How long? How long until this? How long until this? And that's the question that keeps coming up.
Yeah, Habakkuk. I always mention Habakkuk says the same thing before the Babylonian exile. Right. He says, "How long, Lord, will you look on evil?" And, God says, well, I'm getting ready to do something about that. You're not going to like my answer, Habakkuk, but...
I'll give you one. You're not going to like it, but I'll give you an answer.
Yeah, I'll make you like it, but no. So anyway...
Oh, gosh.
Well, he does. I mean, because Habakkuk eventually comes around and is like, okay, well, even if the fig tree doesn't bud, I'll wait patiently. I'll wait for those Babylonians to get theirs, which they do, right? I mean, Daniel, we've already seen that.
The Medes and Persians.
It's interesting though. It's just fascinating how this is continually. So what is the message for us then? I mean, I know we're not quite to the end yet, but what does that tell us? It's, I know there's lots of people right now. I hear it every Sunday now, and it's a good way for us to think in one manner of speaking. But it's like, oh, the end's got to be close now, right? The end is near, and I would say, yeah, and it has been, right, and we need to live with that kind of urgency and that kind of faithfulness. That we are prepared at any time for Christ's return, that we are ready, that we understand that these kind of things are going to happen until the end, until the very end. I got 2 different phone calls this week from folks that are just really upset, and I get it. You look at the news, not only the big picture things we have with wars going on in the Middle East and those kind of things, but horrible news this last week of this person who randomly goes into a bowling alley and just ends 20 some, or however many was it, 18 lives. Just horrific kind of stories like this, and it makes you wonder about the world, but here was my message, and this is what I think apocalyptic, whether it's Daniel or Revelation, teaches us, or Isaiah for that matter. It teaches us that as God's people, no matter how upsetting what's the word I'm looking for? You supply whatever word you want, shaking, or how traumatic these kind of things happen. We are called to trust and to remain faithful in the face of it, to be faithful to God and to trust in His promises. So that was my message, when people call and like, oh, this is horrific things that are happening in the bombings that are taking place, the attack that took place on Israel. All these are horrific things. And don't you think that has to be, have things ever been this bad, And I think if you were living in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, you'd say, it can't get worse than this, right? Yeah. And Jesus, of course, in his upper room discourse, said it's going to happen again. And he says to his disciples, there's going to come a time where the Romans are going to come. He didn't say Romans, but the temple's going to be destroyed again. You see these great stones. There's a time coming where not one stone will be left on the other. And they're like, oh, that's got to be the end of the world, right? And I think that's kind of that's what I think is the message here, is we're kind of always thinking, oh, this is the end of the world. And what we're called, we focus upon that when we're called to really focus upon what God is doing in His people and the sustaining way that He's working. Mm-hmm. Sometimes these things can get people's attention, and I think that's a very good thing for us, and to remember that. Anyway,
well, and I think that the message here is this is coming. I'm not removing you from this.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like this to say, I am going to do something through this. I'm going to, God's going to reveal Himself. We say that there is a time when it will be reconsecrated from from this abomination, but that it is there is a time, like this is there's a time, and it's not like, hey, you get out of this. Oh, you're my faithful one, and you get to go somewhere comfy while all this gets worked out.
Right.
My microphone just fell. But that that you're going to have to deal with some of this as you go through this.
Right. Do you need to put that together? Or, okay.
Oh, no. I got this. We're wrapping this up. We're getting there.
Well, yeah. I just have about 25 more minutes.
That's right.
So
I am bull. I'm strong like bull. Or a goat.
A goat, a ram.
Like who knows? Shaggy goat.
Okay, well, let me go ahead then. Verse 15. I find this always interesting. Daniel always inserts these, and again, it's. I think he's reminding us this isn't from me. This is from God. While Daniel, was watching this vision and trying to understand it. Do you get that picture that he's like, goats and
confused face Daniel here. Like,
exactly.
What am I watching?
And I just find that really compelling in him that he's going, I don't know, because that's not. Most interpreters of Daniel's prophecy, that's not the stance that they take, right? They're like, let me tell you what this means. And then, you see what I mean?
Yeah, Daniel himself is confused, but we've got the arrogance to go like, here's what's really happening.
Here's what Daniel should have understood.
This is Russia and China.
So while I, Daniel, was watching the vision, trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And so here again, this is a divine, supernatural visitor. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. So this one that he sees is telling Gabriel to tell him. And as he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Normal response to an angel. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. This reminds us of Book of Revelation as well, probably. Yep. Mm-hmm. He said, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's what we said earlier. The shaggy
Brilliant.
The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. We call him Alexander the Great.
Shaggy goat. He probably wouldn't appreciate that, would he?
The large horn between his eyes is the first king. The Greeks were known for their, if you've seen the statues, their curls. They're kind of goatish.
I don't know. I'm just thinking of like, if I'm like dominating, I just don't call me a shaggy goat.
Oh, the greatest of all time. I don't know. So the large horn between his eyes is the first king. Verse 22, the four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from this nation. So that's the Diadokoi, but will not have the same power. They were divided, unlike Alexander. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. Master of intrigue because he killed his way to the top. He killed his own brother in order to take the throne.
Seleucus.
He will be Antiochus Epiphanes. Yeah.
He killed Seleucus.
Killed Seleucus. He
with one of the two names.
He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. And there's where I think it's that idea of the stars. Mm-hmm. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes, which, again, some people see this as a supernatural figure, but it could be just the leaders of the Jews, the high priest. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Now, that's an important one too, I think. The whole idea of the Maccabean Revolution, we can glorify Judas Maccabeus and all this, but it comes down to the fact that this is God's the one who's in control. I said that they defeated Antiochus, but really they didn't. What ended up happening is the Romans came and he found himself occupied in other ways. It was God's, God's doing. The vision of the evenings and mornings has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future, is what he says. Seal it up, which is a common kind of thing. I, Daniel, was worn out. This is the response. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond my understanding. And so his response is basically to say, how horrible that all these things will come to pass. How awful that these are the things that are going to happen. So that's chapter 8.
Yeah.
Questions or thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I think we see that Daniel, the effect that this has on Daniel when he has these visions as well. He's not like, oh, I'm a prophet here, and I got this vision. It's like, hey, this is a big deal, and it's affecting him and what he does as well.
Yeah. You're right. That's good. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is good. We're getting through the old Daniel here. So again, I'm going to say this. Revelation reminds me of Daniel, and that Revelation kind of has these cycles of kind of coming back to these visions again, and we see this is kind of a cycle between 7 and 8, where we already have seen a little bit of this story, but we get some more flesh on the bones here in 8 of this cycle.
It's a really good way to put it. Yeah, some more detail of what's going on in a couple of these kingdoms. Yeah. And again, imagine if you're reading this chronologically. I think it would be it wouldn't make sense, right? It's the same kind of visions in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's the we've talked about narrative structure before, but like how the books are written, and like when this story takes place earlier. And if we were putting a timeline, then Daniel 6, exactly. Like it's taken place earlier, but it's structured in certain ways that could kind of point you to certain things. But kind of going, yes, we have to read these things in a context. Looking at and I think that thing at the very beginning where you talked about the Citadel of Susa, and that is a Medo-Persian thing, not a Babylonian thing, but Daniel's in the midst of Babylon at the time. We start to see these non-linear aspects of the story, but those are details that are easy to get lost in, but not. We have to look at the message. What is the message here from all of this? That this is for a time, and then that this is what God's going to do through this.
Yeah. And the end of time, it's these are the things concerning the end, and then we see, but things happen beyond that. And I think it's the same way when we get to Revelation. I was like, this is the end of the world. It's like, but this is referring to things that are happening in the nearer future than what we're imagining, I think. So
they love hyperbole. Hyperbole is a great. I mean, the Old Testament has a lot of hyperbole in it.
You're right.
That yes, it is the end as described, but there's still more to come. Like there's more to the story here. So
Yep.
Well, Brian, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
No problem. It's been fun.
Yeah.
So happy Reformation Day to you.
Happy Reformation Day.
Eat yourself some Reese's
and think about Martin Luther. Yes. Well, if you're enjoying the podcast, we invite you to join us on Patreon. You can sign up for that by going to thebiblebistro.com, and in the upper right-hand corner, you can click support. If you support us at a couple different levels there, we've got some swag. We've got a sticker, coffee cup, T-shirt, all the things you could ever need.
Yeah.
We'd appreciate
just like
that.
Martin Luther, we're interested in getting the Bible into the hands of everybody so they can...
The Bistro, not the Bible, the Bistro. So if you're enjoying it, we invite you. We would love for you to support us in that way. Send us, if you got ideas for topics that you'd like us to talk about, please reach out to us. There's a button on there. You can send us a message, or just share the podcast. We'd love to grow our listenership, and so if you're enjoying it, share along.
Yeah, it's been good to hear from some of you, and the new likes we've gotten on Facebook. I feel like the word's getting out there. We appreciate that.
Absolutely. All right, Brian. Well, we will see you next Tuesday for
Next
Daniel.
Tuesday, non-Reformation Day.
Yep, you got it, Tiger. Daniel 9. See ya.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.